Hello, everyone. Welcome back to It's a Progressive World. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Sam, and today we have the pleasure of being joined once again by Christian Parenti. Christian, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Here's a quick introduction of you, but please feel free to add anything. So you're a professor of economics, a full professor, I'm saying, of economics at John Jay College. Thank you again, Christian. Is there anything you want to add there? I'm not sure.
Nope, it's fine.
Perfect. So yeah,
John Jay has a great heterodox master's program that people should check out if they're in the market for a good master's program where there's kind of critical left-leaning work being done. So that's all I would add. The little plug for the institution. But nice to see you guys again. Good to be back.
Yeah, no, it's very nice to see you as well. Saw you on the Katie Halper show recently, so we thought, maybe you'd come on our show as well. So you have two new articles out. One is on Trump. We'll get to that, but the first one is on diversity. It's called, let me read very quickly
It's
the
in
title of the
Compact
article.
magazine, by the way,
Yeah,
for people
Compact
who want to check it
magazine.
out.
Diversity is a ruling class ideology. So, Christian, do you want to please start by giving us a little overview of your thesis, of your main argument in this article?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what I argued in the piece is, I should say that the piece is very influenced by Adolf Reed and Walter Ben Michaels, who have been arguing against this for a long time. I got no problem with diversity. Diversity is good. I say, like, diversity ideology is divisive, and diversity ideology should not be confused with actual diversity, which tends to inculcate sophistication and tolerance and cosmopolitanism. When you have people of different backgrounds working together, in the United States, basically the history of this country has always been that workplaces are often quite diverse and then people live segregated lives, but generally real diversity leads to tolerance and sophistication. But so my target is diversity ideology, the kind of arguments put forward by Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and the entire industry of diversity, equity, inclusion, which gets millions of dollars. I mean, we don't actually have an estimate on how big that industry is. That there's like a 12-year-old estimate that had it in the low, maybe it was 1.5 billion or something, but it's got to be much more than that now, because most major institutions in the US bring in these diversity trainers, and that ideology, which is essentialist and reductionist and elides class, is all about, I think, dividing the working class. It just seems very obvious that that's what it's about. And one thing that's strange is just how little pushback there is against this ideology. And the whole logic of diversity ideology as a ruling class tool of social control, of dividing and ruling, divide et impera, this is laid out very explicitly in Madison's essay Federalist 10. So the article is about Madison's essay Federalist 10, which is seen as one of the greatest political essays, in the English language tradition, modern English language tradition. And so James Madison, who was an architect, one of the key architects of the American Constitution, a framer of the Constitution, wrote this essay as a part of a series of essays that were written by himself and Alexander Hamilton, who I wrote a book on his developmentalist economics, which are frequently overlooked, and John Jay, just so happens the namesake of the college I teach at. Mm-hmm. And the context was this: the American Revolution happens, kicks off in 1776. The fighting is over by the early 1780s. There's a long, slow process of peace negotiations. Everything is moving by sail across the Atlantic Ocean, so things take a long time. And there's then a treaty, the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And then even before that treaty, peace has settled on most of the Northeast and Central Atlantic by 1780. And there's immediately growing conflict between the states, between various classes, between Native Americans and settlers, between the enslaved and their would-be enslavers. And a lot of this is about class conflict, but there's also interclass conflict. There are rival groups of elites that are going after each other. There's rival groups of speculators making war against each other in Pennsylvania. And this period is known as the critical period, this interregnum in the 1780s. And it really kicks off with a bunch of military mutinies at the end of the war. And it also coincides with two volcanic eruptions. I'm giving you, this is not in the article, I'm kind of bringing in history here, but it coincides with two volcanic eruptions, one in Iceland and one in Japan, that lead to a cooling in parts of the Northern Hemisphere, including in the northeast of the United States, series of bad harvests, tough winters. And then in 1786, winter of 1786 into 87, there's an armed rebellion by indebted farmers in Massachusetts, in Western Massachusetts, called Shays' Rebellion. And this is like full-on warfare with armed columns. A lot of it's like terrorism and arrests and torture and beatings. Well, I don't know about torture, but arrests and beatings and small terrorist action. But there's a part of that conflict which involves force-on-force combat with muskets and cannons, and the rebels are defeated. But that really scares the elites, and they realize we have to create a new constitution, because the 13 states were held together by the Articles of Confederation, which was this loose security compact. That was about it. And the federal government didn't really exist in any form that's recognizable to us today. And they realized we need a strong central state that can do, among other things, that can basically drive forward economic development. That's what Hamilton was all about. So they meet in Philadelphia, and they have this constitution. And the constitution creates a very, very powerful centralized state. The agreement is that there are the 13 colonies that become states, and they all agree that if 9 of the states ratify this constitution, all 13 of us will go along with it. And it is not at all clear, once the Constitution is published, that 9 states will ratify it, because a lot of people do not like the enormous power that is given to this new government. So Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay get together, and they write this series of, I forget whether it's 85 or 84 essays that become known as the Federalist Papers. And definitely the most famous of them is Federalist 10. And it's famous in part because Madison says the quiet part out loud in that essay. And so the essays all address different concerns and also different constituencies. And Madison is addressing economic elites in Federalist 10. And he's addressing specifically the fears that they have that political democracy will lead to economic democracy. And the federal constitution, some of its progressive features that freak out the rich are that there are no property qualifications for holding office or for voting. There are no gender or racial restrictions, right? So the door is open to a potentially very egalitarian form of politics. Slavery is both protected and also the door is open for threatening it, right? The slave trade is protected until 1808, but it's not, so you can read that as well. There's the Constitution protecting slavery, which it is, but Southern elites read it as, wait a minute, that's not enough protection. Only until 1808 we're protected. So elites were concerned that political democracy would lead to economic democracy. And Madison is trying to assuage those fears. He says, look, political democracy does not necessarily lead to economic democracy. And the trick is that basically you've got to keep people divided. And so the operative concept in the essay is the idea of faction. And he says that faction arises naturally in society. And I mean, faction is just division or interest groups, right? He says there's all sorts of sources of this, geography, religious differences, adherence to different political leaders, all sorts of things. But the most common, this is a direct quote, the most common and enduring source of faction. Well, let me actually do Madison justice and read you his quote. He says, the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors also form distinct interests, right? And he says the danger of political democracy is only the danger of political democracy leading to economic democracy is only going to happen if that majority, most common source of faction is allowed to coalesce. If the vast majority of people who do not have property come together and unite against those who control a disproportionate amount of property, then this Republican form of government, this democratic, constitutional democratic government could in fact lead to economic democracy. But the solution is to just lean into the problem of faction, basically. He says, and you can't, it's silly to think you're going to get everyone to agree. That's hopeless. You're never going to have, mass consent and uniformity of belief. So what you need to do is you need to encourage faction. You need to encourage a multiplication of interests and multiplication of issues so that people are bickering against each other and that each faction will throw itself at the levers of government, and they might have some effect, but they're not going to have that much effect if they are a minority faction. They might control one little piece of government. They could get some judges here. They could control a city, here or that, And another thing that's important in all of this, that's not really in the essay, but it's in the Constitution and it's in the rest of the Federalist Papers, is that the form of the American government is essentially this massive shock absorber, right? You've got divided government. You've got the three branches of government. You've got the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. And then within that, you've got all of those three branches, again, reproduced at the state level. And so then there's a division between the federal system and the state systems, and the states retain considerable amounts of power. So this structure of fragmented, layered, counter-levered government is a perfect shock absorber for absorbing the efforts of endless and preferably endlessly proliferating forms of faction. And thus you can have actual democracy, you can have actual political democracy in a technical sense, and not run too much of a risk of ending up with economic democracy that might threaten the powers and prerogatives and property of the elite, of the 1%. So that, in a nutshell, is Federalist 10's argument. And it is the blueprint, it's the explanation for what diversity ideology is all about, right? You don't want people to think about how they are similar to each other. You do not want the American people to come together around the basic economic questions that unite them all, right? You want them to focus on other things, their religious differences, their gender differences, their age differences, their racial differences, the differences in national origin, the differences in region, on and on and on, right? The more differences, the better, to mask the underlying unity, which is that basically everybody needs decent paying and meaningful work. Everybody needs a place to live. Everybody needs education. Everybody needs healthcare. Everybody needs a functioning infrastructure and a functioning society. And it's all about get people off of those questions onto other questions. And it's not that those other questions, in fact, this whole logic, the logic of Federalist 10, the logic of divide and rule, the logic of divide et impera, works best when the diversionary issues are also real issues, right? Truly fake diversionary issues, they burn out too quickly, They're the real issues, So, and this requires a tiny bit of subtlety in thinking. And I think a lot of people in this day and age of social media and being immersed in these computer environments, which are, at the base, just like ones and zeros, yes, no. People fall into this Manichaean thinking where they can't work with contradiction at all. So, in other words, the different needs and interests of women vis-a-vis men in society. That's very real, right? And it's totally legitimate issue. But it can also be used by astute politicians to divert people from the underlying class issue that can unite men and women, you know? So it doesn't mean like, oh, therefore, are you saying, oh, that gender issues don't matter, that women have no interests that are different from it? No. That's not my point, right? It's that these issues, the volume is turned up on issues, and also like the distortion on the issues is such that you must never think of how the specific identitarian question might itself be resolved through universalist means, right? You know, women have specific needs rooted in their biology around birth and child rearing that men don't have. That's different for men, right? But lo and behold, the vast majority of like that set of needs for women would be largely, you know, ameliorated, helped out if we had decent universal health care, right? So again and again, you often find that the legitimate issues of the specific identitarian subgroup are in fact themselves actually going to be best served through a universalist agenda for two reasons. One, because frequently everybody has the same set of issues, which is like, you know, those basic questions of work, housing, health, etc. And also just for the political fact that it's almost impossible to get whatever it is you need in this system if you don't come together with a huge group of people. And only when you get a huge group of people do you then get universal policies, which are then also always the most bulletproof. Social Security is a perfect example of that. I mean, they have been going after Social Security from the day it was conceived. You know, Roosevelt, they were trying to get means testing worked into the Social Security legislation. And Roosevelt said, no, we're not going to have it means tested. It's going to be universal, because if it's universal, then it'll never be repealed. If everybody pays in and everybody gets it, you can't work any divisive logic of like, you know, well, why do they get this? Why do I have to pay for this group to get this or that, right? It's just that logic just bounces off Social Security because it's real simple. It's like everybody pays and everybody receives. Just end of story. And they have been going after, by going after, I mean trying to privatize Social Security for decades and decades, and it never leads anywhere because it's a very popular program, and it's very popular because it's seen as very fair because it's universal. And in its universality, it helps different people in different ways. You know, I mean, the specific needs of a woman are going to be different than that of a man. But if you, in some ways, but if you have a program that provides, you know, income for all people, regardless of their gender differences in their old age, you know, the impact is universally beneficial.
Definitely. I feel like with this last part, I kind of have to throw all my questions, my devil advocate questions out, because you kind of addressed that. Of course, these differences exist, but they kind of utilize them to divide and rule, as you said, or divide and conquer, really.
Yeah.
So
and they also, I mean, they're also not all as real as each other. I mean, race, for example, you know, is, I mean, you can see in American history how it is like it is socially invented. The key event in that is Bacon's Rebellion, you know, and that's the moment at which there's a rebellion in Virginia 100 years prior to the American Revolution in 1676, where there's also a series of droughts, 2-year droughts. And there's a massive like rebellion by Native Americans, Algonquins in the Northeast at the same time against the, you know, ever more encroaching settlers. And those are two linked by climatological, you know, ecological crisis. But anyway, what happens in Bacon's Rebellion is that in Virginia, there, I mean, it's a very messy story. It's not, doesn't break down simply into good guys and bad guys. There are poor white and poor black former indentured servants living on the frontier. the situation in Virginia at this time is that it's basically this, space station that's about mining the soil for tobacco. They're growing tobacco. They're monocropping tobacco vigorously, and it's destroying the soil. And so there's an ecological crisis pushing English, British settlement further and further west, and there's more and more conflict with Native Americans pressing up on that frontier. There's also within the Virginia colony, very serious class divisions. That colony is set up intentionally, and this is the sort of the key for understanding the whole history of the United States South. That colony is set up to be unequal. It's set up by gentry, the younger sons of the landed elite in Britain, who come to Virginia and attempt to reproduce the society of large manors in southern England. And so they have a society of big men and little men, as Wilbur Cash, the sort of a great historian of the U.S. South, put it. The South has always been a society of big men and little men because it was designed to be that way. So you've got all these servants, and they're bringing in these prisoners of war and these religious dissidents from England and Ireland and Scotland. And they're also, starting in 1619, the first people of African descent are landed. Some Dutch pirates have raided, as best we can tell from the record, raided Spanish ships, and they have 20 African captives who were enslaved or were purchased by the Spanish ships that they've raided, and they sell these African laborers to the Virginia colony. It's not, those people are not all automatically slaves. First of all, about 50% of everyone who landed in Virginia died within 5 years. Wow. There was a process of seasoning, it was called. You basically got very, very sick for 2 years. And then if you survive that, you're okay. But half of people didn't live past 5 years. So the question of is this person an indentured servant who has to be released after 7 years or 9 years or 10 years? Or is this person a slave for life? Frequently, it didn't really matter because everybody involved was dead within 5 years. It was a miserable.
Because of the seasonal differences. I mean, because of how just different it was, the seasonal climate and.
Yeah, and because it was filthy. I mean, it was filthy. There was tons of malaria.
Frontier.
Yeah. And so the distinction was not purely about race. It was who from Africa was going to be a slave versus an indentured servant hinged on their religion. And we have one example of this that survived despite all the assaults on the records. There's a guy named Anthony Johnston, who historians now believe was an Angolan prisoner of war who was Catholic. And the Portuguese had missionaries from the mid 1400s in what's now Angola, converting elites in various kingdoms, in the Luanda kingdom, and then also there was conversion, I think, further north in the Bakongo kingdom. I don't actually know if the Bakongo kingdom actually had as much conversion. But in the Luandan kingdom, these elites, many of them, converted to Catholicism, or also did Catholicism and did their traditional religions. And so Anthony Johnston was an elite prisoner of war who was a Christian, a Catholic, and is landed in Virginia somehow. And he shows up in the record in the historical record, as a free man who owns a farm and also has 5 servants. And very often in the language, in the documents, the language is servants. And the distinction between, is this servant an indentured servant or is this servant a slave, is not made clear. Anthony Johnston, one of his servants, flees his farm and goes to the farm of a white farmer. And Anthony Johnston sues this farmer for the return of this servant, because Anthony Johnston says, I've got the contract for this guy's labor. And the court says, this worker has to return to Anthony Johnston because, he's got the contract, right? So that's just one example of how race was not paramount. In Bacon's Rebellion, what happens is you have poor white and black frontier farmers coming together and going against Native Americans because there's increasing conflict around livestock, which is part of the environmental crisis. the deer have all been hunted out because of the commercial buckskin trade, and the beavers have all been hunted out for the fur trade. And so into the vacuum flows hogs generally. And so there's like specific conflict around these hogs. And then there's this, war sets off, and these poor farmers want Native American land. And so they recruit a newly arrived elite, Nathaniel Bacon, to be their leader. And they wage this illegal war against the Native Americans, which then turns into, because the colonial authorities, the governor of the colony, Governor Barclay, doesn't want them to do this, partly because he and his clique monopolize the trade with Native Americans, and also they don't want to set off another war. There's already been a generation earlier a really massive war between the English settlers and the Native Americans. So Governor Barclay is like, whoa, you guys, you're not allowed to go make war on these Native Americans. Long story short, that foray against actually what were allied, Christianized Native Americans, who Berkeley had set up as a kind of buffer, turns into a class war in which this force of poor farmers, both white and black, take Jamestown, the capital, and burn it to the ground and drive the elites off to Maryland. And order is not restored until the British send in ships and Royal Marines to suppress the rebellion. And, the last holdouts are a group of, white and black settlers, about 100 of them. And, with a mix of white and black, poor farmers holding out together, right? So the elites restore order. Bacon, the leader, the namesake of the rebellion, he actually dies of the bloody flux, dysentery, hemorrhagic dysentery. And after order is restored, new slave codes are written, and they're developed for a number of years, number of decades. And only in 1704 is the color line finally crystal clear in the law that regardless of one's religion, anyone of African descent will be enslaved for life, and their progeny, their children, will also be enslaved for life, right? And indentured servants, regardless of their religion, who are of European origin, have to be released after 7 years, and they have to be given land and weapons, right? So they have to be given a little stake in the big project of these elites. And then you're off to the races. That's the class race kind of arrangement that becomes the story of the U.S. South, right? So you see this, you see in the story of Anthony Johnston, in this rebellion where there's poor white and black people coming together, you see other possibilities that are snuffed out because they're dangerous.
Yeah, I was surprised. How come race, not religion? Because religion seemed to have been Christianity seemed to have been the easier way to go. It seems to me it had already an infrastructure. How come race became, because as you say, a slavery all around the world existed, and it was not racial at all, whatever race is,
Yeah. Partly it has to do with the end of the English Civil War. I mean, the flow of the English Revolution is kind of complete, and the flow of these prisoners from Europe, from the British Isles, is dwindling, and the flow of African laborers, enslaved African laborers, is increasing. So it lends itself to that. There's also elites who are refugees from Barbados and other parts of the Caribbean, where there have been massive slave rebellions, are making their way to the Carolinas, and that has an influence. And it's partly because the workforce in the plantation economies of the South is also becoming increasingly African. So that I don't know specifically. I haven't read the debates. I'm sort of what did they ever debate in the Virginian House of Burgesses? This question: why not religion? But I would guess that also, you can convert, right? And with a phenotypical difference, this person's skin is dark, this person's skin is pale. You can't convert You can't change that the way you can change your religious beliefs. So,
And I guess kind of, and I get you, I think you point this out in your article, but this has also been kind of in all these differences and pointing out the importance of it, which of course you don't deny there are some differences, but they've also been kind of internalized by the left, right? And not only the left who don't think that material things are important, even those who do think that it's about material stuff, they will point out that, well, it's different for this kind of group, for this kind of reason. And although there is some truth to it, I'm sure you would say there's some truth to it, but at the same time, it can be counterproductive to lean into it too much.
Yeah, I mean, there are real differences. I mean, slavery produces racism, not the other way around, right? And racism produces real material different outcomes for racialized groups, right? So,
and they add up over time and years and make
and compound and all that. But the problem that the left falls into is thinking that addressing those disparities, which are important to address, that somehow adds up to the class struggle. And so what we get is, a situation.
Symptoms.
What was that?
I think, sorry, they're addressing symptoms rather than the fundamental, I think, issue.
Yes, addressing symptoms, but or also just addressing
different things.
Addressing a different. I mean, addressing the question, addressing a subsection of the question of why is there poverty, right? So in the latter part of the essay, I deal with this question of like, who are the poor? And if you Google, poverty stats, you're going to find endless stuff about who is poor, but you're not going to find very much at all about who the poor are. Like if you want, I want a pie chart of the poor. I want to know where they live. I want to know how many of them are women. I want to know how many of them are immigrants. I want to know, how many of them are white, how many of them are black, how many are Latino. It's very, very hard to find that. Instead, what you find are the rates of poverty for this group, the rates of poverty for that group, the rates of poverty. And the effect is that like people think, oh, well, if you just address all of these different disparities, that's somehow going to add up to a class struggle that's going to address the underlying issue, right? And addressing the disproportionate suffering of African American trans people in the U.S. South is important, but it plus every other little disparity doesn't add up to an end to poverty. That only happens when the poor come together as a class to fight for economic redistribution. It's not going to happen when poor people unite under the banner of different identities and demand under those subsets, those small factions, that they not suffer from poverty as much as they currently do. It's only when people come together as the poor, as the working class, and demand redress as such that you're going to get such redress.
And I want to ask you,
this is subtle, but I think it's a very important distinction.
No, certainly. And I want to come and ask you a question about the stats stuff, but there's this line in your essay that I love, and it's not about the left thinking that if you address this issue, that there's poverty, is about Hillary Clinton, but it's great. And you put differently, and with apologies to Hillary Clinton, ending racism won't break up the banks. So I think this is just exactly what you're talking about earlier on. But going back to the stats and stuff, I just have
which if people don't get it, that's like, Bernie Sanders in one of the debates is talking about, I forget what he's talking about, whether he's specifically talking about banks or just class in general. She says, well, breaking up the banks won't end racism. And that's like, ooh, gotcha. But it's like, what about the opposite? Right? Like, ending racism won't break up the banks. And this is Walter Ben Michael's point. It's that the diversity ideology really, they never quite say it, but if you listen closely, what they're struggling for is a world in which 13% of the 1% are African American and only 13% of the 2.2 million prisoners are. It's gone down recently. It might not be that much anymore. Are African American. Now that would certainly be a less racist version of American society, but it would not be class equality. It would not be economically more egalitarian. And we're seeing that. I mean, we have a Supreme Court with 4 women on it, right as there's been this historic defeat for reproductive rights, right? And it's like, the elite is becoming more integrated, yet common people are suffering economic deprivation at greater rates than ever before,
and are more divided. But when it comes to these stats, I mean, it's kind of sub point, but academics or researchers and all this, I mean, I don't think they would have bad intentions, or they don't want to contribute to the elite's power by, when they do stats, divide into this group and divide into that group. I mean, what it is, do you think it is that they're just trying to be more academic, more detailed, and more rigorous into, okay, let's talk about this subpart group? Is that kind of also what's leading their ideology, or not ideology?
Yeah,
way of work?
The vast majority of people just receive categories through their education and reproduce them, and don't question them. I mean, that's generally what it takes to get ahead, is you don't question what the system is telling you. This is a little caveat about this. I remember talking to a special forces guy, guy had been at the U.S. Special Forces, and I said, and actually the guy didn't look that fit, and I was kind of like, I didn't say, hey, you don't look that fit. How are you, in the Special Forces
again?
But I was sort of trying to broach that. And he said, the thing is, like, he said, the training's actually not physically that difficult. There's a lot of really, really fit people, in the military. It's like, but the thing is, it's like, psychologically, you have to trust the system. Like, you cannot panic when you're like, in the water in hour 30, and the helicopter hasn't come to pick you up yet. You cannot think, these guys don't know what they're doing. I'm going to freeze to death. I'm going to drown, right? You have to think, it's okay. They know what they're doing. The military designed this training. All I need to do is just make sure my life preserver doesn't come off, and just keep treading water, and I'll be fine, right? And it's just like, you have to have faith in these categories. You can't like think, well, is this zip line really going to hold? It's going to hold. You just rappel out of the helicopter. Just have faith in this, right? That's how most people get ahead, right? They accept the categories given them. They're not like, well, wait a minute, should we, excuse me, boss, maybe we've framed the problem completely incorrectly. It's like, get out of here, man.
Yeah, exactly. That's the best way to get on someone's bad side.
Yeah. Now, that said, there are also key, like, choke points in the intellectual system where gatekeepers do make decisions. An example of this that came up a couple years ago was the head of the Ford Foundation, which is an enormous foundation, which basically controls much of the U.S. left. You'd have to fact check this, but somebody in this field told me the other day that the Ford Foundation has to spend something like $14 million a week or something just to meet its legal status, because foundations have to spend a certain amount of their net worth every year.
Classify as a foundation.
Yeah. To not basically pay taxes, right? I mean, just an enormous amount of money. And Darren Walker, who's the head of the Ford Foundation, he's African-American. And this was back in, I think it was around the last time, Bernie ran. He wrote this really explicit letter where he's like, we need to not criticize capitalism. We need to remember that the system that provides all of this bounty with which we can address these social problems is capitalism. And, in our quest for social justice and in our change-making work, we need to stay within the guardrails, and we need to be realistic about, the beneficent nature of capitalism, essentially, that we cannot be questioning this system. We can be adamant in how we deal with the symptoms, right? But we can't question the underlying thing. He actually said it, I mean, he felt that threatened by, or his milieu felt that threatened by Bernie Sanders and the rise of a kind of, a class consciousness that really, since those days of Bernie's 2 runs, has been snuffed out. And Bernie himself has not done much to nurture that kind of consciousness that was developed at that time by, for
That's
example,
actually,
That's for sure.
supporting his
yeah,
friend, good friend Joe Biden, and going along with this war in Ukraine, and I mean on and on and on. But
yeah. No, just that's what I wanted to. Like this was a great example. I was gonna ask, like, do you think the elites, like the times of James Madison, are really conscious? Because these days you look at the elites and you look at the populace, the same. It doesn't feel anybody is politically conscious, including the elites. It feels like everybody's just sort of winging it or on autopilot mode. And but this example you gave, I guess, kind of shows that some of them are like class conscious
yeah,
or but you know what I mean? Like, do they
yeah, I know what you mean.
actually
And
actively encourage or yeah, exactly.
I've been saying this for years. The ruling class is like any other class, and it develops class consciousness through class struggle. And part of the problem with the ruling class these days in the United States is that it is becoming rotten because of its own victories, And so the Darren Walker letter is actually an illustration of how ruling class consciousness develops. When there is no challenge to the 1%'s class prerogatives, they don't have to think of themselves as a class. But when they're suddenly threatened as a class, then they have to defend themselves as a class, and then they develop class consciousness. Wait a minute, we don't actually want to raise taxes on ourselves. We don't want to give our money away. No, the answer is now that you're demanding it from us, turns out, no, we don't want to share. If no one's demanding, hey, you guys have to share, then it's like you can think about other things, right? And you can see, during the high Cold War, post World War II to the late 70s, early 80s, the American ruling class was much more rational. I mean, it was evil and out of control and warmongering and nuts in a lot of ways, but they were very aware that their economic system required careful management and leadership and was not going to reproduce itself automatically, and that it was being challenged all over the planet, and that those challenges had to be met not just with bombs and brutality, but with like very sophisticated campaigns on every front to build and rebuild consent for the system. With the neoliberal turn, the victories against the socialist left in the third world, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the triumph against trade unions, the defeat and the domestication, co-optation of the left domestically and internationally, basically removes this burden of rallying the wagons and defending the class interests of the elite, and their consciousness becomes increasingly fragmented, right? And so you just get you get elites who think about what's good for my business, what's good for banks, what's good for the healthcare industry, what's good for my immediate concerns, rather than what's good for the reproduction of capitalism, right? So as a result, we have a healthcare policy in the United States that does not make a lot of sense for many other factions of capital. Industrial capitalism, many other forms of capitalism, of capital, many other industries would be better off if we just socialized healthcare costs, because healthcare costs, we have this like out of control profiteering, extremely expensive. It's another thing you can fact check, but I mean, I think we have, if not the most, I think we have the most expensive healthcare
you hear it all the
in the
time.
developed world, right? And some of the worst outcomes in the developed world, and
Relative
those costs are not all borne just by workers; they're also borne by employers, and
by the state,
but also by employers. I mean, employers would be many employers would be better off if the state was just like, we got this bill, don't worry,
Or even middle class people and up, they would be better off too, probably, or like all kinds of people.
Yeah,
who are perhaps
definitely be better off.
Yeah, but even above that, people who are
like factory owners, in case of like injuries, I'm sure that would make things simpler and like more economically beneficial to them. But moving on from the elites, though, now talking about the masses, or I guess majority of people, like, do you see any potential of them coming together as a class, like the poor as a class coming together, or us, I don't know. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't seem to be at all on the cards at the moment. As you said, the latest one was like Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, that type of thing, that they all basically got destroyed. I
Yeah, I
mean,
mean,
Jeremy Corbyn just recently, they said they're not going to even let him to run as a Labour candidate. I mean, so
yeah.
it's just, yeah.
I'm not optimistic that we're on the verge of some sort of class conscious awakening and a mass movement based on class. No, I think we're in a very bad we're in a bad situation, and I think one of the impediments is the obsession with identity politics on the left, and I think that is a very important uh, um, distraction that's getting in the way. So yeah, I mean, I'm not particularly optimistic. I mean, the material conditions are there, but the material conditions are always there, right?
Yeah.
What makes the subjective conditions, people's consciousness, catch up with the material conditions? That, of course, is like that's the key question in politics, and I don't have the answer for, you know. I mean, I know that class struggle requires class consciousness and it produces class consciousness, but like how to get from this fragmented, demoralized state to something, you know, better, where people can come together and say, hey, you know, we're not working, we're not cooperating until our demands are met. That's very far. That's very far away, and I don't know.
Some people,
I'm not particularly optimistic.
some people are arguing that there is a bit of a turnaround against the woke culture and identity politics. Like they refer to certain, I forget, but certain, I think, like hirings by New York Times or by universities and stuff. Do you see that, or do you think that's not visible? You
Maybe.
don't
I mean, I
see
think
that?
there's some, but you know, where I teach, we have the president of our university was a gang prosecutor. She's an African American woman. She's describes herself as a, you know, a fundraiser, a bundler for both Democrats and Republicans. She was a top prosecutor in the Justice Department. She spent a lot of time prosecuting gangs in Puerto Rico. And I mean, she is, you know, she pushes this diversity stuff nonstop on our college. And the great irony is that I mean, it's plenty diverse. I mean, and the issue that, you know,
It usually
that
happens
bothers
in the
most
most
kids is that they're
diverse
poor.
places.
What was that?
It usually happens in most diverse places like LA or like, you know, like London, or you know, they have a tendency to overcompensate, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it happens also. I mean, it also happens, you know, in, you know, majority white colleges, private colleges love to tear themselves to pieces and, you know, self-flagellate over this stuff, create crises. I mean, it happens everywhere. So, yeah, so
And
there's some pushback, but it's like, I mean, I'm seeing it encroaching in John Jay. And what's interesting is like, you know, the students, this is a commuter school, or working class kids. We're what's called a Hispanic serving institution. It's a federal designation because we have more than 40% of our students are Latino, and you know, but everybody is working class by and large. Here and there, you'll have some middle class kids, but I mean, there are, you know, and in the graduate programs, you'll have people from upper middle class and even elite backgrounds. But I mean, there are basically no rich kids whatsoever going to John Jay, and everybody's, you know, they're you know, they come out of these rough neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods. You know, they're like the best and the brightest of some of the worst public schools in the city, basically. You know, and it's like their concerns, from what I can tell, is that they're primarily economic. You know, that's what they worry about.
But this
And
person that you're mentioning, the president, the former president, but she's not doing these things for, and I don't know, I don't think she's concerned with ruling, or the ruling, you know, the same way as the ruling class would deploy these ideologies. I mean, they're kind of doing it because they're
yeah,
easy wins, right? I mean, they're just, you know, just like why corporations do it. They're just easy wins of making yourself seem like a better person.
easy wins. You know, getting a lot. I mean, you know, and
Yeah.
she, you know, she has risen through the ranks to be in the top part of the Justice Department, and now to be president of a very large university in New York City, and doing that by like keeping your
Yeah,
finger to
exactly.
what's
Yeah.
hip, what how, and doing what's coming down from the foundations, what's what the elites are saying, and then that's what you do, right? So
Yeah.
that's how she does it. But there is also a kind of bureaucratic self-interest. What's she going to do? What's she going to say to these kids? What are your issues? You guys are poor. What would life be easier if we didn't charge you tuition? Let's
Yeah,
work on that. That's not what she
exactly. I
does.
mean, that she can't do that. I mean, yeah,
She can't
exactly.
do that. Yeah, she could, but
Then she
that
wouldn't
would
have the
require,
job.
if she was going to do that, that would require that she then turn around and go to Albany and
Yeah.
start harassing the political elite of the state of New York, being like, hey, you guys have to make tuition free at these public colleges. Yes, I'm going to go on the news and give interviews about this. I'm getting together with deans and presidents of other public universities around the country, and it's like, tuition-free public higher education in America. I'm going to participate in that, and yes, I'm going to bring it up at the cocktail party and put it in your face, Governor Hochul. And yes, I'm going to go to Albany and say things that are uncomfortable to you. Well, I mean, that's not how she got this job, and that's not how she keep that job. People who do that get removed, because the other elites that ensure that they keep these jobs, the boards of trustees. I mean, she was appointed outside the entire process. There was a big search underway, and then they, from outside, she came in. This kind of stuff happens all the time in New York City. It's just so much corruption in this country. It's
and everywhere.
Yeah.
And soft corruption. It's like, it's probably not illegal, but it's not the standard process. But it's, as a university president, a public university, you get along with the political class, or you're not going to do well.
Certainly.
They just removed a bunch of Iranian university teachers because they supported the recent protest. I mean, but they said it was due to scientific, academic reasons, not due to political.
Right.
So yeah, exactly. They get away with it somehow.
Yeah.
And Christian, I'm a bit conscious of the time. Don't want to take too much time, so I just want to maybe move to your other article, the Gray Zone one, titled "Trump Against Empire: Is That Why They Hate Him?" And I was thinking, instead of, I mean, please feel free to summarize it a bit, but I also kind of wanted to ask you this hypothetical question, because Trump and foreign policy is, I mean, that's like one of his areas now. I don't think he went down this direction that you talk about in your article because necessarily it's his belief, perhaps, it is, but it's also like the base that he knew he could mobilize in that sense. But when you think of Russia and Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, do you think he would have acted differently? Do you think, I mean, how do you think he would have acted if he was in power?
I do not think that we would be fighting this proxy war in Ukraine if Trump were president. I think that he would have, gone along with the Minsk agreement, and there would have been some sort of, we probably would have been at the place where this war is probably going to end, which is with some sort of security guarantees and autonomy for those eastern, Luhansk and Donetsk, and a land bridge to Crimea, and that the war that begins after the Maidan revolution, where there are these Nazis, I mean, like actual Nazis, the Azov battalion are actual Nazis, as in they are, adherents of to Adolf Hitler, and they like swastikas, right?
And you're not some kind of,
they burn a trade union building in Odessa, and that's part of, and they start pressing on the, and the new government, the post-Maidan government, starts outlawing the Russian language, shutting down their television stations, and the mining industry and other industries in the east, in the heavily Russian-dominated area, were worried that they were going to also be privatized and lose their jobs. Another thing about Ukraine that is very interesting, that in 2000, so there was a process of land privatization in the Ukraine that then basically stopped in 2000, when there was a law passed. I think it was actually, maybe it was 2003. It was between 2000 and 2003. A law was passed that made it illegal to sell land. So there actually haven't been agricultural land markets in Ukraine. And there's actually a kind of like proto-peasant class emerged. There's a lot of small farmers in Ukraine. And so the breakup of the old state farms that whole process of, shock doctrine privatization was kind of arrested, and national businesses and small farmers have been protected. And there's been pressure to undo that, right? So that's another threat. So because of threats to the Russian language and, Russian television stations, and threat to these industries that are still state-owned, and to agriculture, which is still protected by this, very uncapitalist law that prevents the privatization of land, right? This Russian minority, which is a majority in the East, rebel. And there's then 8 years of war, and their cities are being shelled. The majority of people who are killed in this war are Russians. And yes, the Kremlin is assisting as best we know, but they're not throwing themselves all the way in. People also have to remember, the opposition in Russia are not a bunch of liberals, Western liberals, as the New York Times and the Washington Post would have you believe. The opposition are ultra nationalists, and they're like, you, Putin, are allowing Russian people to be murdered every day by Nazis because you don't have the balls to do anything about it. And he's feeling real pressure on that. And, that's the prehistory of the war. And it'll probably end with, a land bridge to Crimea and the Luhansk and Donetsk autonomous and with a security guarantee. I think that was essentially, part of what the Minsk agreements were going to do. And I do not think Trump would have gone into this war like this. And I think that because what I lay out in that article, which is that he didn't start any new wars, but.
And you're not delusional about Trump. I mean, your first sentence here is Trump was ideologically incoherent and crassly transactional. Do you think he would have behaved differently because it would have been to his benefit, or perhaps in this case there wouldn't have been much of a benefit, maybe because just too much of the system was on the other side, kind of, against the war? Or why would he have behaved differently in this case?
We'll never know, but I don't think he would have. I don't think we would be in this situation. And the reason is, as I lay out in the article, I wrote that article because I'd had a number of conversations with people who, on the left, who couldn't bring themselves to consider the evidence that indicates that the FBI intervened in the last presidential election. And they did this, most importantly, by acquiring Hunter Biden's laptop. First of all, the entire left was just like, oh, that's fake. Until about 6 months ago, when the New York Times and the Washington Post finally admitted, okay, yeah, the laptops are real. This really happened. But people were like very sophisticated, very ardent leftists were just like, that's all fake. It's totally fake. And we know that it's not fake. Hunter Biden did leave his laptop at this shop in Delaware. And the guy who owns the Mac shop was like, Hunter Biden signs the contract saying, if I don't pick this up in 6 weeks.
In 6 weeks. Yes, 6 weeks. He had a 6 week.
Yeah, that I revert, I lose ownership of it. So the guy goes into that laptop, because he's going to wipe it and resell it or something because it's his property. He has documented that he attempted to contact Hunter Biden again and again and again. And he opens up and he starts realizing, he's like, whoa, this is like Hunter Biden's laptop. And like, there is, never mind the drugs and the prostitutes, there's evidence of like real corruption on that laptop. And this guy gets scared, right? He's like, whoa, like what's going to happen to me being in possession of this? And so his father brings a copy of the laptop. So to protect himself, he makes a copy, right? His father brings the laptop or a copy of the laptop information to the FBI in Arizona, where his father lives. The FBI reject that. They don't want the laptop. In December 2019, which is, I think, about 9 months later from when his father went and tried that, the FBI come to the shop and like, give us the laptop. They take the laptop and they hold the laptop until after the elections. Then in the spring of 2020, they start putting out stories. They start communicating with social media and the legacy media saying, hey, we think there's a Russian hacking operation underway, and there's going to be these fake news stories coming from this. It's all mixed up that it's fake, but then also sometimes it's hacked information. And they tell the media, this is Russian disinformation, be on guard. And then it's, the guy who owns the Mac shop is getting freaked out. So he's told at one point by the FBI, they say, generally nothing happens to people who keep their mouths shut about stuff like this. And he's like, whoa. Like what? And what happens to people who don't keep their mouths shut? And generally, not always, but sometimes people keep their mouths shut about this and stuff bad happens to them anyway. So he gives a copy of the laptop to Rudy Giuliani. Giuliani gives it to the New York Post. The New York Post are like, and Giuliani obviously is like, wow, now we've got our October surprise. We're going to roll this story out right before the election, and we're going to blow a gigantic hole in Joe Biden's campaign, and Trump's going to win. The New York Post runs with this story. Twitter censors the New York. Twitter like shuts down the New York Post's account. This is the oldest newspaper in the country. Okay, it's right-wing, it's a tabloid, but it's not like some fly-by-night nonsense.
Yeah, Rudy Giuliani underestimated the other side. I mean, how far and powerful they kind of are.
And the entire mainstream media is just like, this is fake, and they kill the story. And that is the FBI putting its thumb on the scale for the presidential election. So anyway, I mean, I'm just interested in this because it's like, I live in this country, it's an election. I'm not in favor of the domestic intelligence agencies intervening in elections, you know? I'm not a Trump supporter. I don't like Trump. I did not vote for Trump. I voted against Trump. I voted for Biden, in fact. I kind of regret it. I do.
What are you going to do?
Yeah.
Were you in a what do you call it?
So I'm trying to get good friends of mine to just like discuss the news. And they're like, what are you talking about? Like, why would the ruling class have anything against Trump? Why would anyone in the system do anything against Trump? The guy gave the rich massive tax breaks. He deregulated industry, and that's all true. And that's what you read was the deck. That's like the kind of Max, the editor, wrote that. And it's like the article begins with the line that's not in bold, which is, as president, Donald Trump gave the rich massive tax breaks and deregulation. But what he did that the system did not like is he went to town on the American empire. And he did that not because he's like some sort of anti-imperialist. He did it for crassly transactional reasons. He's just like, look at these, these foreigners are ripping us off. We've got these military bases all over the world. We're providing protection everywhere, and nobody's paying us. This is a ripoff. So he viewed the American empire as a poorly run security business, which is to misunderstand profoundly what the American empire is. The American empire, since 1945, at the end of World War II, is the security architecture for the reproduction of global capitalism as a whole, right? American firms have, pride of place within that, but the U.S. is about reproducing capitalist social relations in general. And it does that through, bases, diplomacy, all sorts of stuff, right? Trump went after all of that, and he did it not because he was an anti-imperialist, and he did it not because he was a Russian agent, because he also did things that the Russians didn't like. He hated Nord Stream 2, right? Because he wanted to sell gas to Europe. He didn't want the Russians to sell gas. And that, I argue, is why they hate Trump and why they have gone after him, because he wanted to withdraw 1/3 of the troops from Germany, which is the heart of NATO. He basically wanted to destroy NATO. He wanted to withdraw. He floated the idea of withdrawing all troops from South Korea. He started by withdrawing a quarter of them. He withdrew troops from Somalia. He withdrew troops from Syria. He withdrew troops from Iraq, and he withdrew troops from Afghanistan, and he negotiated an end to the Afghan war. People who think that Trump's negotiations, or Hamid Khalilzad's, I forget Khalilzad's first name. I should know that. Spent a long time in Afghanistan, but Khalilzad negotiates this. I mean, people, because there was this horrible debacle and spectacle of basically Afghans suffering. People think, oh, the Biden ended the war. It's like, no, that Trump created the whole framework for that. The Taliban were on board with the U.S. withdrawal. The Taliban were basically protecting the U.S. withdrawal. There was a suicide bombing at the gates of Kabul airport. That was ISIS that did that. The Taliban are basically defending the U.S. as it's withdrawn. If there hadn't been that negotiated end to the war achieved by Trump, it would have been a fighting, bloody escape, right? And the reason that the withdrawal took place under Biden was because the Pentagon refused to cooperate. And so the timeline had to be extended. And all the way through, Trump's advisors were sabotaging his efforts to the point that they were even stealing documents off of his desk. One document would have, basically trashed a free trade agreement with South Korea, and that was stolen. So my argument in the piece is that, Trump, for these very crass reasons, I mean, he's a Philistine, right? I mean, he's certainly not an anti-imperialist, but he did real damage to the American empire. And I think that the security establishment and other elites got very, very frightened by that. This guy was like out of control, and he was doing real damage to American power at a global scale.
I just want to it's not really a pushback, but there is an argument that there is a segment of American security elite that is way much more focused on China and thinks the whole Russian Ukraine war is a waste of time and money in a way. And he may have been more closer to them, and that's why he was trying to court North Korea, because like in case of Iran, he wasn't particularly, kind. I mean, I think that had more to do with the fact that Obama negotiated the deal. But putting that aside, what do you think of that his main focus was China, and he wasn't like, it wasn't so much that he was anti sort of NATO per se. He wanted to reshift the focus of NATO, let's say.
Well, he was definitely anti-China, but he was anti-NATO. He was constantly talking about
that was one of his biggest things.
What was that?
Oh yeah,
that was one of his biggest things. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Being against, yeah.
Camille.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that, all of the books about Trump are pretty clear. I mean, it's the same, you read them and it's like the same guy appears again and again. Nobody has written a book saying, everyone underestimates Trump. Trump is actually a deep thinker. He spends a lot of time reading. I've never seen anyone with as much focus as Donald Trump. He's a fantastic listener. They never say that. They say he gets easily distracted. He loses track of stuff. It's just like superficial. He's like always has the television on. He's constantly like short term, like how am I doing in the ratings kind of thing. And so I don't think that Trump had deep strategic ideas. I think he had this kind of crass, we want more money, pay me. And he said with the South Koreans, he was like, I want cost plus 50%, right? You got to pay for the entire cost of the U.S. deployment plus 50%. And then towards the later part of his presidency, that he was saying they all need to be cost plus 50%. He would say stuff like, let's shut our embassies in Africa. I mean, because he's a racist, right? Let's remember, he called Haiti and all African countries. He said in relation to immigration, and why are we getting people from these shithole countries like Haiti and African countries, right? It's totally racist, right? And so he was like, we should shut our embassies in Africa. I mean, Africa is a very strategically important place, and U.S. embassies do a lot more than process tourist visas. Okay, it's like that's where the CIA is always headquartered. Connected to these embassies. China is moving into Africa, like AFRICOM, a separate U.S. command focused on Africa, was established to counter China. So all this stuff is like way over Trump's head. Yeah. He doesn't get this stuff.
Fair enough. Yeah,
6 months into it, this I think is the perfect illustration. 6 months into his presidency, the Joint Chief of Staff, this is Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is the head of all the armed forces in the U.S. This is at that time, I think it was all male. There might have been one or two women in it, but I don't think so. So this is a group of like some of the most powerful men in the world have a meeting with Trump at the Pentagon in this famously secure room called the Tank. And they have this presentation. They're trying to talk sense into the president to explain to him what the American empire is, how it works, these trade agreements, these relationships, these bases, all of this stuff. And he's like bored with it and annoyed. And he says, you guys are a bunch of babies and what was it? Babies.
Yeah, you wrote
you guys are dopes and babies and losers who can't win wars. He says, we've spent $7 trillion in, which is probably an overestimate, but we've spent $7 trillion in the Middle East where, and they're not sending us free oil. He says, where's the fucking oil? That's what he says to their faces. I hope it's okay to swear in this. Yep.
No,
and they're like, what? And this guy doesn't get it. And he's like, where's the oil? Let's go. Cost plus 50%. Come on. And that's why he went to town on it, right? So, I mean, I closed the essay by saying, he attacked the American empire in different ways and for different reasons than would left anti-imperialists and socialists, but he threatened it and he did damage to it nonetheless. And that is why I believe that the FBI put its thumb on the scale and why there's been a campaign against him and his supporters. I have another article coming out in Compact that gets into this further around the FBI. And it doesn't mean I like Trump, and it doesn't mean I like, the politics of his supporters, but, I'm a social scientist. I have the responsibility to think objectively about material reality and about politics, right? And it's like, I have been shocked by the number of very sophisticated people with progressive politics who don't do that, who do deductive things like, well, Trump assisted the ruling class, therefore the system that benefits the ruling class and the ruling class itself would never move against Trump. No, there's more to the picture than that. He went after American empire, and that's why they don't like him.
Certainly. But yeah, thank you, Christian. I mean, and your articles, we'll put the links and down in the description box. I don't know, Sam, did you have anything else to say? I want to ask you, Christian, what else are you thinking about working on these days? But I think it might be getting a bit long, so I won't bother you with that much unless there's something.
We can discuss that the next time we meet, if there's a next time, which hopefully there is, because you guys are very patient with me monopolizing your airwaves and not letting you ask enough questions.
Not at all. We really enjoy it. Well, okay. Well, thank you, Christian. And if anybody has any comments, questions, criticisms, please leave them below and we'll try to get to them. So thank you for watching.